How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. It's time for part two of my list of 100 favorite films. And before I start out, I'd like to thank everybody who watched my first video. I had more views than I ever expected to have. I was quite surprised. Plus, a lot of really terrific comments. So, thank you. I appreciate it more than I can say. All right, let's start off. This is going to be, let's see, number 80 through number 61, 20 films. So, starting off with Alfred Hitchcock, Shadow of a Doubt, 1943. Fantastic thriller, film noir, character study. Teresa Wright plays a young woman living in Santa Rosa, California, living in a very idyllic family life in a beautiful small town. And her name is Charlie. She's named after her uncle Charlie, who is a man she's never met, but she's heard a lot about. Turns out that Uncle Charlie is going to come for a visit. She's very excited. He's played by Joseph Cotten. And as time goes on, she begins to have very serious suspicions that Uncle Charlie might just be a serial killer, known as the Merry Widow Killer, a man who sort of seduces older women who have a lot of money and then kills them. And she finds some very incriminating reasons to believe this, and it's fascinating how it's all sort of woven together. Great script, great acting by everybody involved, and a terrific ending too. All right. Next up is a film that I could not leave off of my favorites list because I love it so much, The Wizard of Oz, which is the enduring classic. The magic never goes away for me. I grew up watching this movie on television in the 1950s and 60s, like everybody else in my generation. And when I was a kid, we only had black and white TVs. So when Dorothy opened up the door to Oz and everything was in color, for us it was still in black and white. But we had imaginations back then, so we enjoyed it anyway. And it wasn't until in the late 60s when I actually got to see it in color for the first time. I've actually seen the movie on the big screen more than once, and that's the best way to see it because it unfolds in a way that you just would not believe. And Judy Garland's performance, 16-year-old girl, the most intuitive actress probably who ever lived, and she was so mature as an actress even at that age, and it's a fascinating film. So now we're going to go about as far away from The Wizard of Oz as you can get. This is an Italian horror film classic called The Horrible Dr. Hitchcock, also known by various other titles like The Terror of Dr. Hitchcock or The Terrible Secret of Dr. Hitchcock, directed by Riccardo Freda, 1962. Beautiful, dazzling color film, great cinematography, starring beautiful Barbara Steele, also Robert Fleming, and it's all about a very strange doctor, whose name is Hitchcock, who has perfected an anesthetic, and he likes to use it at home with his wife because he's a necrophile, and he gets turned on only by women who are either dead or appear to be dead. So then he makes a mistake one night, he gives her a little bit too much, and he kills her. And for some strange reason, that doesn't turn him on. So he goes away for a while, comes back with a new young bride played by Barbara, who has no idea what's going on. This was her third horror film in her very young career, and she made this in about a week while she was still under contract to Fellini to do 8.5. And this time she gets to play a victim. She's not the evil witch, and it's a good performance and a very good film. Next up, Touch of Evil. Orson Welles directed, wrote, and starred in this film, which is about the ultimate film about police corruption. Great film noir. He clashes. He's a corrupt police chief who clashes with a Mexican narcotics officer played by Charlton Heston, who is married to beautiful Janet Leigh, and this happens to be taking place right at the border between Mexico and America. So it gets very, very involved, and it's a very kind of a labyrinthine story which needs to be seen many, many times in order to get all the details. But I find that it gets better every time I watch it. It unfolds more and more. Great guest stars, including Marlene Dietrich, Mercedes McCambridge, and Zsa Zsa Gabor. A lot of interesting things happen. So, plus that fantastic opening shot that takes several minutes where this man and woman are driving in this convertible very slowly through town, and the young woman keeps saying to her boyfriend, "I hear ticking," not realizing that there's a bomb in the back of the car. So Anyway, I'm babbling. Next up is another film noir classic from 1945, Fritz Lang's Scarlet Street, starring Edward G. Robinson, Joan Bennett, and Dan Duryea. I recently reconnected with this. Hadn't seen it for years, and I managed to get this on Blu-ray, which is a beautiful image. Very involving story about a middle-aged man named Chris Cross, played by Edward G. Robinson, who gets involved with the ultimate femme fatale, played by Joan Bennett, and her sleazy boyfriend, Dan Duryea, and it just destroys his life, and it's fascinating to watch. Okay, next up, Woody Allen in his very first serious film, Interiors, 1978, which gets a lot of gets a lot of negative reaction, but I've always loved it. I love this movie very much. Diane Keaton, Mary Beth Hurt, Sam Waterston. It's Woody Allen's homage to the films of Ingmar Bergman, and when I first saw this, I didn't know that much about the films of Ingmar Bergman. I just kind of took this on its own, and I love the imagery, and I happen to think it's a very interesting story. And Allen, he didn't want to be in this film because he knew that as soon as his face showed on the screen, everybody would think it was a comedy. And he wanted to really do something serious, which nobody was expecting him to do. Okay, next up is one of my favorite teenage juvenile delinquent classics, Crime in the Streets, from 1956. Great cast of actors: John Cassavetes, Sal Mineo, Mark Rydell, who later on became a famous director, as did Cassavetes. And let's see, who is the I forgot who the good guy is. The good guy who's trying to help them. James Whitmore. Okay. Takes place in New York City in a slum. John Cassavetes is a very angry young man who doesn't like anyone to touch him. He's angry with his mother, with his younger brother. He is leader of a gang, and he is planning to kill somebody. And along with him is his two henchmen, Mark Rydell and Sal Mineo. Now, Sal Mineo had just come off of playing in Rebel Without a Cause, and he was quickly becoming known as the Switchblade Kid, playing some of the best juvenile delinquents in films, and I've always loved that movie a lot. Next up is a film that I don't own. This is another Alfred Hitchcock film. It's called Notorious, 1946, starring Cary Grant, Ingrid Bergman, and Claude Rains. I've only seen this film once. It was very recently in a film class, and just absolutely fell in love with it. It's a very complicated story. It has to do with, Ingrid Bergman plays a woman who is an American citizen, foreign born, and her father happens to be a convicted Nazi. But she's a very loyal American. She is recruited by Cary Grant, who is an American agent, to help them infiltrate some former Nazis who have gone to Brazil to live after World War II. And one of them is Claude Rains, a man who once was very much in love with her and a friend of her father's. So she gets involved in doing this while she's also falling in love with Cary Grant. And it's a very strange relationship because she's notorious for being very promiscuous. That's a problem for him. And he is asking her to use her seductive power to infiltrate this man's life. It's a very, very good film. And I have to say that after this film showed in my class, this is the only time that I can remember in any of the classes where everybody broke into applause. Everybody loved that movie so much. Okay. Next up is a horror classic that has to be on my list, Boris Karloff and the Mummy, 1932, or it might be 1933. I love this movie so much. Karloff, a lot of the movie is very slow, but I actually think that Karloff is very, very good in his portrayal here. The makeup, the opening sequence where the mummy comes to life, it just never fails to get to me, even though I've seen it many, many times. Speaking of horror, here's another one that I love with beautiful Barbara Steele from 1964, The Castle of Blood. The original title was Danza Macabra. It's a very morbid vampire story which has to do with vampires coming back to life once a year on the eve of All Souls Day so that they can drink blood from a new victim and then come back the next year. And they all have to replay their violent deaths every year, and it's very creepy. The story actually has a lot of holes in it, but it's beautifully shot, black and white, directed by Antonio Margheriti, And Barbara is probably in this film she does the best performance she ever gave as far as her imagery and her weirdness, besides Black Sunday. So highly recommended. Next up, Dark City, a great combination of film noir and science fiction that never gets old. I've seen this on the big screen as well, and I love to see it every time. Dark City, great special effects, great acting. Next up, for all of you who are record collectors like I am, this is your signature film, High Fidelity. John Cusack, Jack Black is also in it. I love this movie so much. It says a lot about people who love records and find meaning in just organizing records and finding music that relates to what's happening in their lives. My favorite John Cusack performance as well. It's very funny movie, and some good music along the way too. Next up is Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, starring Gene Hackman, also with Terry Garr, Cindy Williams. This was kind of Coppola's answer to Antonioni's Blow Up, all about I'm kind of losing track of what I wanted to say here, but it's just a very intense story. Harry Call, played by Gene Hackman, is a man who is a surveillance expert. He specializes in sounds, and he can magnify sounds from a long distance and get information and spy on people. And he's being used in this to it's a very complicated plot. He thinks he's doing something. He thinks he's doing one thing, and he finds out that he's done something very different, and it actually destroys him. It's a very, very downbeat, very sad story, but a great performance by Gene Hackman. Like that film very much. Next up is an Ingmar Bergman film that I just recently saw. It's called Winter Light, and I have to say that I've always kind of resisted watching that many Bergman films. I've only seen two in my life up until very recently. I saw The Seventh Seal many years ago, and I also saw Autumn Sonata at the theater when it came out. But that's pretty much it. And recently I decided to start watching some that I had sitting on the shelves, and this was one of the first ones, and I just was blown away by it. It's all about a Lutheran minister who has lost his faith and is having a crisis in his personal life as well as his work life, his faith life, and it's just one of the saddest films I've ever seen. I don't know what else I can say about it, but I only watched it once, and I definitely want to watch it many more times. Beautiful, stark, black and white cinematography, great acting by everybody involved, and the reason why I always resisted trying to get into Bergman films, I just felt that they would be so far above my head that I would just be a babbling fool trying to understand them. And I'm finding that I'm still a babbling fool, but I do like them, and I want to experience them more. So it's opening up a whole new cinematic adventure to me. All right, next up, this is Stranger Than Paradise, directed by Jim Jarmusch, from the early 1980s. John Lurie, one of my favorite actors in films, who unfortunately didn't make a lot of films, but this is a fascinating black and white black comedy about a couple of New York City slackers and their cousin from Hungary, who just go on this odyssey to Florida, and it's kind of impossible to describe, but I've loved this film ever since the first time I saw it. It's just unbelievably strange, and a good introduction to Jarmusch and what he does in the cinema. Okay, next up, one of my favorite horror films from the old days, The Tingler. I couldn't leave this off the list. Vincent Price, oh my God. The Tingler, directed by William Castle. This is the one where in the select theaters there were certain seats that were wired up with this electrical thing that they could give people a buzz every once in a while when this monstrous Tingler was supposedly crawling around the theater in the movie and in real life, right? Sure it was. Vincent Price is a doctor who finds out that when people are extremely frightened and they can't express their fright for some reason, that there's an actual creature that comes to life. It grows along the spine, and it could kill the people unless they can scream or express their fears. It's a fascinating little movie. Black and white, although there's some red color tinted, and it's the first time you ever see Vincent Price take an LSD trip on screen. Worth seeing. Next up is a very important film for people in my my sad little generation, Easy Rider from 1969. Dennis Hopper stars and directs, along with, what's his name? Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, plus a lot of other people, Luana Anders. It's a great little movie. I saw this when I was a kid and was totally entranced by it, and like everybody else in my generation, it ruined my life. No, I'm kidding. It's still fascinating to watch. The music is great, and I don't know, I just love Easy Rider. I can't help it. I'll never grow up. Nobody in my generation is ever really going to grow up. Star Trek let's see, what's Star Trek number 4 or number 5? Anyway, yeah, Star Trek number 4, The Voyage Home. One of my favorite Star Trek films. As a Trekkie, this one has so much good humor and so much environmental message connected to it, and I just love it. I don't know. What can I say? It's Star Trek. Next up is another film that I don't own. This is a film called Calvary, which came out in 2014. It's an English-Irish film directed by John Michael McDonagh, starring Brendan Gleeson as a priest named Father James. This is contemporary Ireland, and he's stationed way out in some remote village, a very small church, very small congregation. And at the beginning of the film, Father James is in the confessional, and a man is telling him that he was abused as a child by a priest. And he is so angry, he's never gotten over it. It's ruined his life so much that he intends to kill Father James the following Sunday on the beach near the village. And Father James spends that next week or so trying to figure out which one of his parishioners is this man so that he can help him. It's a fascinating film. It has little bits of comedy wrapped into it, but Father James is a very interesting character because he is shown to be a very decent man and a very decent and faithful priest who would never hurt anybody. He is also someone who came to the priesthood later on in life. He was married. When his wife died, he decided that he would enter the seminary. He also has a daughter who is now grown up, and they have kind of a difficult relationship, and she has actually tried to commit suicide, and she felt for a long time that when her father went into the seminary that he was abandoning her. So they have a very difficult but loving relationship. And it's a fascinating film, and I think in this day and age when there's so much sadness and scandal and so much negativity connected to the priesthood, that they would show a priest that was a very faithful and good priest. So that was kind of interesting. Okay, very much worth seeing. I saw that in a film class as well. And finally, this is one of the best science fiction classics ever made, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Another film like The Wizard of Oz, where for me the magic never goes away. I've seen this on the big screen maybe 3 times. I saw it when it first came out, 1977. Totally fell in love with it. And it never stops being just a fascinating feast. It's not just beautiful because of its special effects and cinematography, all of which are really fantastic, but just because of the human story that goes along with it. Richard Dreyfuss, Terry Garr, Melinda Dillon, who will just break your heart. Everything about it, the way they react to what's happening around them, and one of Spielberg's masterpieces, I think. All right. Okay, so that's my second collection of films, and I'm glad that you stayed with me. I hope that you enjoyed it, and comments are welcome. Good night.